Good morning, good day, or good evening, wherever you are, people. Golgari means graveyards, it means moldy crypts, and it means a bunch of things dying. So get ready to go through more than 30 commanders together with me. A small PSA before we get into the video. I did livestream the research for this video, mostly for myself so I could finally have a time and space to work on this stuff, but I really enjoyed people giving suggestions in chat. It enhanced my experience, and it is a chance for you guys to leave like an imprint to suggest certain commanders and certain pet cards of yours. So whether you are simply sitting at home, opening boosters to enjoy the magical place of Lorwyn Eclipsed, or have already moved on to the even more magical place of the sewers of New York City, sit back, relax, and enjoy. Let's kick things off with Amzu Swarm's Hunger, a 5 mana 3/3 insect shaman. She comes with Flying and Menace, which are great keywords for evasion, and she grants other insects you control Menace. Additionally, whenever one or more cards leave your graveyard, you may create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token. Then put a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the greatest mana value among those cards. Do this only once each turn. There are different ways for cards to leave your graveyard. Maybe the easiest one is returning creatures from your graveyard to your hand. Enchantments like Oversoul Cemetery do this at an incredible rate. For just 2 mana at the beginning of your upkeep, if you have 4 or more creature cards in your graveyard, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Additionally, over the years, Magic has seen a bunch of 1-mana artifacts that exile cards from graveyards. Relic of Progenitus and Scrabbling Claws, as well as Ghost Vacuum, all kinda do the same thing of exiling things. Kaervek, the Punisher, is a 3-mana 3/3 that, whenever you commit a crime, exiles up to 1 target black card from your graveyard, and you can then copy it. You may cast a copy. If you do, you lose 2 life. You can also reanimate cards. Yes, reanimate, 1 mana, put target creature card from any graveyard into play under your control, lose life equal to that creature's casting cost. For just 1 mana, you not only get to get a huge thing from your graveyard back, but you also get to create a huge 1/1 black and green insect token. So what are these cards with immensely high mana costs? I personally would mostly be looking at creatures, especially the added value of Reanimate, where you get, yes, the thing you reanimate, but also a second body that comes with Menace is pretty good. The classics are stuff like Draco or Shadow of Mortality that simply come with extremely high mana values of 16 and 15. But you don't need to go quite as far. Sipsig Muckdraggers and Necropolis Fiend play multiple roles in an archetype like this. They both have Delve, which means you can cast them for cheap quite early in the game if you have some form of self-mill, which you would obviously play in a deck like this. Delve makes it so cards leave your graveyard, so they kind of act as an enabler. In your graveyard, they also act as big mana costed creatures that can leave your graveyard and subsequently create a large insect token. Both of them also come with abilities that trigger Amzu's third paragraph. Necropolis Fiend taps and you pay X to exile X cards from your graveyard, and target creature gets -X/-X until end of turn. Sipsig Muckdraggers, on the other hand, triggers on an ETB and returns target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Since Amzu only triggers once each turn, you might not make the most use of this ability, but still, it's noteworthy. And then, what do you do with giant creatures? Well, you beat someone to death, but also you can play cards like Return of the Wild Speaker, where for 5 mana on an instant, you can draw cards equal to the greatest power among non-human creatures you control. Or you ramp with Traverse the Outlands, a 5 mana sorcery, where you get to tutor up X basic lands, where X, again, is the greatest power among creatures you control. Currently, in Standard Magic, cards typically have 1 or multiple of 9 permanent types. There's land, creature, artifact, enchantment, slightly obsolete planeswalkers, at least in Commander, even more obsolete battles, or one of the non-permanent spell types like instant and sorcery. Especially with the return of Lorwyn, we now also have the Kindred type back, and that is relevant for the next commander on the list. Baba Lysaga, Night Witch, is a 3-mana 3/3 human warlock. She taps and sacrifices up to 3 permanents. What do you get? Well, if there were 3 or more card types among the sacrificed permanents, each opponent loses 3 life, you gain 3 life, and you draw 3 cards. An effect like this we can split up. Making your opponent lose 3 life is quite valuable, but it's not game breaking. Gaining 3 life is worth maybe even less. You drawing 3 cards, on the other hand, is extremely powerful. It is only powerful, however, if the rest of your deck supports the strategy. So I looked outward into the endless skies of Scryfall, and the first mechanic that of course comes to mind is Delirium. Delirium cares about you having 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard. Thankfully, Baba Lysaga will fill up your graveyard in no time. Omnivorous Flytrap is a 3-mana 2/4 that whenever it enters or attacks, if you have Delirium enabled, you can distribute 2+1/+1 counters among 1 or 2 target creatures. And then if there are 6 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, you then get to double the number of +1/+1 counters on those creatures. Traverse the Ulvenwald is a 1-mana sorcery that searches for a basic land. But if you have Delirium enabled, you can either search for a land card, not just a basic land, but indeed any land, or maybe even more powerful, for a creature card of your choice and put it into your hand. There is a couple of Delirium cards, and I'm sure you will find them. There is some pseudo-Delirium cards, like Deluge of Doom. For 3 mana, you get an incredibly efficient sweeper, because all creatures get -X/-X until end of turn, where X is the number of card types among cards in your graveyard. While it is not specifically a mechanic, there is a creature type that also cares about number of card types among cards in your graveyard, and that is of course the Goyfs. The goat Tarmogoyf and its cousins Nethergoyf and Barrowgoyf all care about the number of card types in your graveyard and have some upside and natural synergy with Baba Lysaga. There's also the artifact Altar of the Goyf, 5 mana. Whenever a creature you control attacks alone, it gets +X/+X, where X is the number of card types among cards in your graveyard. Altar of the Goyf itself is a tribal artifact which would provide 2 permanent types to the sacrifice ability of Baba Lysaga. I think the way to break this card is to play cards that give additional permanent types to permanents you control. Ashaya, Soul of the Wild, is quite notorious. For 5 mana, you get a card that turns all your non-token creatures into forest lands. So not only will your creatures be creatures, potentially artifact or enchantment creatures, no, they will also be lands. Subsequently, only 1 card could be enough to fulfill the clause of Baba Lysaga. Yigra, Eater of All, is a very hungry cat, and it views everything as food. For 5 mana, other creatures are food artifacts in addition to their other types. Mycosynth Lattice does a similar thing. For 6 mana, it turns all permanents into artifacts in addition to their other types. On a side note, on my research to find stuff that has the most permanent types, I found Hammer of Perforos. Of course, Hammer of Perforos is a red card, so it won't be of any use for any of the commanders we talk about today, but it is a very interesting card. It gives all your creatures haste, which is a good effect and quite on par at 3 mana, but more interestingly, for 3 mana, tapping it and sacrificing a land, you get to create a 3/3 colorless golem enchantment artifact creature token. Now that is not only quite a mouthful to say, it is also 1 card that would technically fulfill Baba Lysaga's clause, as it is a creature, an enchantment, and an artifact. Do with that what you will. I have no idea if there's any use for an effect like this out there, but I found it to be quite interesting. A bit more on the nose is Belby, Corrupted Observer, a 2 mana 2/2 zombie elf. At the beginning of each player's post-combat main phase, that player adds 2 colorless for each of your opponents who lost life this turn. At first, and in theory, this card is already slightly asymmetrical, as you have 3 opponents who can lose life, whereas your opponents most of the time can only damage 2 of your opponents. They can't attack themselves, at least. In reality, this card is much more lopsided. When I see a card like this, the first first thing I am looking for is 1-drops that can reliably damage all players at the table, or at least all 3 opponents at the same time. This effect is on a surprising number of cards like Mardu Shadowspear, Night Market Lookout, Pulse Tracker, Thornbow Archer, or Vicious Conquistador. All of these drain all of your opponents on attack. All of these cards, in theory, can trigger Belby's ability the turn she comes down. In a not so unrealistic scenario, you play a Pulse Tracker turn 1, turn 2 you play Belby. You then attack with Pulse Tracker, and in your post-combat main phase, you will gain 6 colorless mana. So obviously the next step is to look for 6 mana colorless payoffs, because that is the dream scenario. Chimio the Inner Sun is a 6 mana legendary artifact that causes spells you control to be unable to be countered. At the beginning of your end step, you can discover 5. So in Christmas Wonderland, you play Pulse Tracker turn 1, Belby turn 2, main phase 2, you play Chimio the Inner Sun, and then it triggers at your end step. So you will have played potentially 14 mana worth of cards by the end of turn 2. If that's not absurd, then I don't know. There's other good payoffs like the Immortal Sun, 6 mana. At the beginning of your draw step, you draw an additional cards. Spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, and creatures you control get +1/+1. Conduit of Ruins lets you search for a colorless creature with converted mana cost 7 or greater when you cast it for 6 mana. Additionally, the first creature spell you cast each turn costs 2 less to cast. Anti-Causal Vestige is a 6 mana 7/5 from Edges of Eternity. When this creature leaves the battlefield, draw a card, then you may put a permanent card with mana value less than or equal to the number of lands you control from your hand onto the battlefield, tapped. Of course, you don't need to stop at 6 mana creatures. That leaves our full colorless cards like Decimator of the Provinces, which is kind of like a mini overrun on a creature, or, you know, the all-famous Eldrazi like Kozilek Butcher of Truth, which for 10 mana draws you 4 cards, has Annihilator 4, and when it is put into a graveyard from anywhere, instead you shuffle it into your library. Similarly degenerate is Beledros Witherbloom, a 7 mana Elder Dragon. It is a 4/4, has flying because it's a dragon, and at the beginning of each upkeep, not just your own, you get to create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life. Now the kicker, for 10 life, you can untap all lands you control. Activate only once. I think if you have somewhat of a combo player's mind, you can see how incredibly broken this is. Wizards tried to balance it with the clause activate only once each turn, but really that's not enough to stop a dedicated combo player. Beledros reminds me a bit of Bolas' Citadel, a 6 mana artifact that lets you play cards from the top of your library for paying life instead of the mana cost of the card. Additionally, you can sacrifice 10 non-land permanents and each opponent loses 10 life, but really what Bolas' Citadel does most effectively, it provides card advantage with a way to cheat mana. That's why it's a game changer. Beledros itself is a 4 mana 4/4 that slowly accrues a lot of value by creating 1/1 bodies. It also cheats on mana because you can play it, pay 10 life, and immediately get all the mana back you just paid. To make use of the many 1/1s Beledros creates, you could play cards like Ashnod's Altar, which sacrifices creatures to add mana to your mana pool. You could play cards like Plum the Forbidden, which is a 2 mana instant that I've been dying to test out in one of my decks. As an additional cost to cast the spells, you may sacrifice 1 or more creatures. When you do, copy the spell for each creature sacrificed this way. The effect, you draw a card and lose 1 life. Now, how do we get around this pesky clause, this safety valve that Wizards put on this beautiful combo piece of activate only once each turn? There's multiple ways. The first that comes to mind is sacrificing Beledros and reanimating it. Gorya's Vengeance for just 2 mana can return a legendary card from your graveyard to play. It will count as a new entity and thus you will unlock the ability to pay 10 life and untap all your lands again. A more sustainable way might come in the form of a creature that I always think about when I think combo in green. Temur Sabertooth does not have the Temur colors, but is instead a mono green creature. For 4 mana, you get a 4/3 cat. And for 2 mana, and not tapping, very important, you may return another creature you control to its owner's hand. If you do, Temur Sabertooth gains indestructible until end of turn. Now, of course, we don't care about indestructible, we care about replaying Beledros. If you have 9 mana, you can infinitely play Beledros. If you have 10 mana in the form of lands, then, well, suddenly you have infinite mana. And what do we do with infinite mana? Well, there's an infinite number of possibilities. Maybe the easiest way would be a card like Exsanguinate, which for 2 black and X drains each opponent of X life and you gain life equal to the life lost this way. Not only does this serve to kind of balance out the very steep cost of 10 life, it can also serve as a one-shot finisher should you go infinite already. Next is Blex, Vexing Pest, which is quite difficult to say. It comes as a suggestion from a viewer during one of my live streams. Yes, in order to get these videos done, I started live streaming the research, as the research takes, I'd say, roughly between 6 and 9 hours, depending on the amount of commanders. So whenever you're free on a Monday or Tuesday, you could check if I'm streaming right now. Blex is interesting for one fact specifically, and that's because it's a double-sided card. Not only is it a double-sided card, no, it is a sorcery on the back side. I believe in Magic Arena there once was a format where you could play signature spells, and this very much reminds me of that. Having a sorcery in the command zone can greatly change the way the match plays out. But let's first start where things start, at the front side. Blex, Vexing Pest, is a 3 mana 3/2, and it gives other pests, bats, insects, snakes, and spiders you control +1/+1. When it dies, you gain 4 life. For a commander, this is not exactly what I'm looking for personally. The effect is very meh. The first thing that always comes to mind when I read this combination of weird, icky creatures is Swarmyard, a very powerful land. It taps for colorless, but it also taps to regenerate target insect, rat, spider, or squirrel. So not a one-to-one overlap with Blex, but it is super low opportunity cost to play in a deck like this. Next, I tried to look at the most generically good cards of those creature types, and there's not that many. I mean, spiders, we got a few with the Spider-Man cards. I personally don't want to play with Spider-Man cards, but if you do, that's perfect, and you have like good support for the spiders at least. If we're thinking in-universe spiders, Arasta of the Endless Web is decent. For mana 3/5 reach, whenever an opponent casts an instant or sorcery spell, create a 1/2 green spider creature token with reach. When it comes to insects, stuff like Blight Beetle might be interesting. 2 mana 1/1 protection from green, that's already almost good enough to play in a deck, but creatures your opponents control can't have +1/+1 counters put on them. No, each pot varies, but +1/+1 counters are kind of ubiquitous right now in Commander in my opinion, so very cool effect. Snakes provide stuff like Fanatic of Ronos, a 2 mana 1/4 that taps for a green, but if you have a creature with power 4 or greater, it taps for 4 green, which is just the best rate you can have for a card like this on a 2-drop. Additionally, technically it also eternalizes, so should this card end up in your graveyard, you can pay 4 mana to create a 4/4 token copy of it. The nice thing, you will always have a 4 power creature if this is a 4/4, so it will always tap for 4 mana. Enough about the front side, because really it is relatively straightforward, where it is a mix of many tribes. Let's talk about the back side. On the backside, Blex is a sorcery, namely the Search for Blex. It costs 4 mana, 2 generic, 2 black, and you can look at the top 5 cards of your library and put any number of them into your hand and the rest into your graveyard. Then you lose 3 life for each card put into your hand this way. This reminds me a bit of Sylvan Library, where it is card advantage but at the cost of life. Very notable though, Sylvan Library makes you put the cards back on top, whereas this puts them into your graveyard, and as we all know, especially in black, sometimes the graveyard is just an extension of your hand. So what this presents is a very powerful card advantage spell from your command zone. I've been trying to look into ways of building a black-based Spellslinger deck, and there isn't too much there right now, but it did get a huge boost with Strixhaven, and guess where we are going this year? Yes, one of 3 in-universe sets this year is going to be Strixhaven. But let's take a quick look at the status quo. Very importantly for Spellslinger decks, you need stuff that makes your spells cheaper. Stuff like Cloudkey, an artifact where you choose either artifact, creature, enchantment, instant, or sorcery, and then those spells cost 1 less to cast for you. Semblance Anvil presents a more powerful cost reducer, but at a higher cost. It also costs 3, but when it enters, you need to exile a non-land card from your hand. Spells you cast that share a card type with exiled cards cost 2 less to cast. There is more cost reducers, but I'm sure you can find those. What are the payoffs? Sedgemoor Witch is a 3 mana 3/2 human warlock, is menace, and ward pay 3 life. Whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, you get to create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token. When this creature dies, you gain 1 life. Now this works nicely because it kind of ties the front and the back side of Blacks together. We also got Professor Onyx, which is just Liliana in disguise. 6 mana, she's a planeswalker, and Magecraft, so whenever you cast or copy an instant or sorcery spell, each opponent loses 2 life and you gain 2 life. She has some other texts, but honestly, it's too much for me to bother to read through it all. On the topic of planeswalkers, we have Karth the Lion. For 4 mana, you get a 3/5 human warrior. When Karth enters the battlefield or a planeswalker you control dies, look at the top 7 cards of your library. You may reveal a planeswalker card from among them and put them into your hand. Put the rest on the bottom of your library in a random order. So immediately we can see that this is card advantage for a Super Friends deck. What's even better is Planeswalker loyalty abilities you activate cost an additional 1 to activate. Remember that paying more loyalty counters for a Planeswalker ability is actually an upside. You can pair this effectively with any green and black Planeswalker. What I did specifically is look at Planeswalkers where the +1 made a very meaningful difference. For Davriel, a 3 mana planeswalker that only has 1 down tick ability, where for -1 target player needs to discard a card, this means you can indefinitely use that ability as it will turn into a 0 cost ability. Garruk, Cursed, and then you can't read the rest because it's borderless, is a 6 mana 5 loyalty planeswalker. For 0 loyalty, you get to create 2/2 black and green wolf creature tokens with, when this creature dies, put a loyalty counter on each Garruk you control. With the Karth out, this will turn into a +1. Conveniently, for -6, you get an emblem with creatures you control get +3/+3 and have trample, the classic overrun effect. Similarly, Liliana Death's Majesty and Sorin Markov both share a similar upside where you can play them on curve, use their +1 or in Sorin's case +2 ability once, and next turn ult. In Liliana's case, destroying all non-zombie creatures. In Sorin's case, getting control of target player during that player's next turn. Nissa might not have quite as powerful of an ult, but at least she gets to survive if you use her +1 with Karth on the battlefield. If you're looking to build a Super Friends deck, of course, always also look for proliferate cards, as you can proliferate Planeswalker loyalty counters. Evolution Sage comes to mind. The classic combo of having Doubling Season double the loyalty counters of Planeswalkers on ETB is of course something you should also consider. The Chain Veil makes it so you can activate loyalty abilities of a Planeswalker twice, and Staff of Completion plays an interesting role in a deck with Karth as its head commander, because for 3, you play an artifact that can either proliferate or destroy target permanent you control in a pinch to trigger Karth's first line of text, which we should not underestimate. Card advantage could really come in handy in a long and grindy game. I don't have too much to say about Cheville, Bane of Monsters, except for he's a Giga Chad. He reminds me a lot of Geralt from the Witcher series, and, interestingly, it is not the only card that puts bounty counters on creatures. For 2 mana you get a 1/3 Death Touch, that at the beginning of your upkeep, if your opponents control no permanents with bounty counters on them, puts a bounty counter on target creature or planeswalker an opponent controls. And whenever such a permanent controls would die, you gain 3 life and draw a card. You don't even need to kill it yourself. Very Witcher-like, taking on one contract after another. But he's not alone in his craft. Bounty Hunter is a 4 mana 2/2 from Tempest that taps to put a bounty counter on target non-black creature. It also taps to destroy target creature with a bounty counter on it. What a match made in heaven. There's also Termination Facilitator, a 2 mana 1/3 that taps to put, again, a bounty counter on target creature or planeswalker. You can only activate it as a sorcery though. And whenever a creature or planeswalker an opponent controls with a bounty counter on it deals damage, it is destroyed. Again, I don't have deep thoughts on this guy, but if you're looking for a flavorful Witcher type commander, Cheville's your guy. I have about 4 copies of Dina Sol Steepa sitting in my pile of potential commanders. It is a 2 mana, Golgari colors, 1/3 Dryad Druid. Whenever you gain life, each opponent loses 1 life. For 1 mana and sacrificing a creature, Dina Soul Steeper gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. Dina is interesting because she combines a almost Voltron ability of giving herself +X+0 with a typically more go wide associated effect of turning your life triggers into drain effects, kind of. Of course, when we read when you gain life, each opponent loses life, we're thinking Exquisite Blood to go infinite. Whenever an opponent loses life, you gain that much life. Boom, that's a 2-card combo that you can include that will make your deck a lot better. The way I would approach this as still kind of a go wide type deck that gains a lot of life from myriads of smaller creatures triggering off of each other entering, and then combining it with huge cards like Sign of the Wild, 3 mana, Star, power and toughness are equal to the number of creatures you control. Very easily you can see how this pairs well with going wide and how you could sacrifice this creature to give Dina +X+0, where X is the sacrifice creature's power. Majestic Myriarch is a 5 mana Star Chimera. Its power and toughness are equal to twice the number of creatures you control, and at the beginning of each combat, it gets flying until end of turn if you have a creature with flying, and first strike, double strike, death touch, haste, hexproof, so on and so forth. So the typical keyword sharing. Those creatures hit quite hard, but you can also sacrifice them to Dina, which is very nice. And two other cards that I could see working nicely with Dina is Tend the Pests, which plays well with also the Sign of the Wilds and the Majestic Myriarchs. It's a 2-mana instant. As an additional cost to cast this spell, sacrifice a creature, and then you create X 1/1 black and green creature tokens with, when this creature dies, you gain 1 life, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. So you can see how you could turn Majestic Myriarch into a myriad of small creatures that all trigger an ETB where you gain life. Those creatures you could theoretically sacrifice to plunge into darkness, a 2-mana instant where you choose one. Either you sacrifice any number of creatures and then you gain 3 life for each sacrificed creature, or you pay X life and then look at the top X cards of your library, put one of those cards into your hand and remove the rest from the game. If you pay an additional 1 black mana, you get to do both. And here you see a classic payoff for a go white strategy that in this case could give you, I don't know, like 15 3-life triggers for Dina to drain your opponent. Glissa Sunslayer is a bit of a nightmare of mine from Limited. It's a 3-mana 3/3 Phyrexian zombie elf. It has First Strike and Death Touch, which is just an abomination of keyword combinations. And whenever Glissa deals combat damage to a player, choose one. You draw a card and lose 1 life, you destroy target enchantment, or you remove up to 3 counters from target permanent. First of all, I want you to remember that this creature will hit players a lot, because nobody wants to block a First Strike Death Touch creature. Then we can go through the modes. Drawing a card and losing 1 life is always good. Destroying target enchantment is quite situational, but it will come up in almost every commander game. Then we have the mode of removing up to 3 counters from target permanent. Now this one was particularly interesting for me because I've just played a bunch of Lorwyn pre-release, and Lorwyn Eclipsed cares a lot about -1/-1 counters and removing them. Moonshadow is a 1-drop that has been making splashes in Modern. It is a 1-mana 7/7 menace, but it enters with 6 -1/-1 counters. Whenever 1 or more permanent cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, while this creature still has a -1/-1 counter on it, you get to remove a -1/-1 counter. Glissa can turn this creature on quite quickly. Similarly, Bristlebane Battler is a 2-mana 6/6 that comes with 5 -1/-1 counters. It has Trample and Ward, so it's really good on rate. Dawnhand Dissident is a 1-mana 1/2 that makes use of the new keyword Blight, which is you putting -1/-1 counters on something, and then Surveilling 1. Or you Blight 2 to exile target card from a graveyard, and as a static ability, during your turn, you may cast creature spells from among cards you own exiled with this creature by removing 3 counters from among creatures you control, in addition to paying the other costs. If you're looking at a not so distant Edges of Eternity, Baloth Prime is a 4-mana 10/10 that enters with 6 stun counters. Whenever you sacrifice a land, create a tapped 4 for a green beast creature token and untap this creature. For 4 mana and sacrificing a land, you gain 2 life. Very notably, of course, Glissa does not differentiate between the kind of counters she removes, which means you could also save your Unstoppable Slasher from getting stopped. It's a 3-mana 2/3 Death Touch zombie assassin. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, that player loses half their life rounded up. Should Unstoppable Slasher die if it had no counters on it, return it to the battlefield tapped, under its owner's control with 2 stun counters on it. Stun counters that you can remove with Glissa. This line of text, if it had no counters on it, does ring a bell. That's because both Persist and Undying can bring a creature back from the graveyard as long as they didn't have counters on them. Simply mechanics made for Glissa Sunslayer. We have another Glissa on this list, Glissa the Traitor. For 3 mana, 1 black and 2 green, you get a 3/3 zombie elf with First Strike and Death Touch. Again? Whenever a creature an opponent controls is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you may return target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. So unfortunately we don't get to put it into our battlefield. But it doesn't really make a difference if what we're getting back is 0 mana artifacts. If we dissect this commander, first line of text cares about creatures and opponent controls being put into a graveyard. Our opponents won't always do us the favor of playing a bunch of creatures that go to the graveyard, so I always make sure to include cards like Forbidden Orchard, which gives them very generously 1/1 colorless spirit creature tokens, or cards like Longstalk Brawl, a 1 mana sorcery from Bloomburrow, where you can gift a tapped fish, aka give someone a tapped 1/1. Longstalk Brawl plays double duty in a deck like this because it also makes you choose target creature you control and target creature you don't control, and then those creatures fight, which most likely will lead to an opponent's creature being put into a graveyard from the battlefield. Cards like Bushwhack fulfill a similar role, and remember that Glissa has Death Touch, so a card like Ram Through will always kill any creature no matter the toughness, unless of course it has either protection or indestructible. And what are we getting back? Well, just the most degenerate of stuff. Lotus Petal, Mishra's Bauble, Tormod's Crypt. If your pod is in the right power level, you could be getting back a Lion's Eye Diamond. If you're discarding only 0 mana artifacts, well, it won't matter that you don't have a hand anymore. A kind of boring artifact to get back, but not a bad one, is Wayfarer's Bauble. 1 mana and 2 mana to sacrifice it to get a basic land out of your library and put it onto the battlefield tapped. A more exciting role player artifact is Triangle of War, a 1 mana artifact. For 2 you sacrifice it, and then you choose target creature you control and target creature an opponent controls. They each deal damage equal to their power to each other. One more card that plays a similar role, Executioner's Capsule. For 1, it's an artifact, and for 2 in tapping and sacrificing it, you get to destroy target non-black creature. Very easy to see why this would be good in a Glissa the Traitor deck. First in line of quite a few food token commanders is Greta Sweet Tooth Scourge, a 3 mana with 3/3. It's a human warrior. When it enters, you get to create a food token. For a green and sacrificing a food, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. You only activate this as a sorcery. For generic in black and sacrificing a food, you draw a card and you lose 1 life. Greta to me is interesting because she provides counters. She's a sacrifice outlet, but she can also be card advantage. There is so many cards that come to mind for a food package. If you are into Universes Beyond, I recommend looking at all the hobbits, because hobbits are famously very much into food. If we're taking a look at in-universe, there is a bunch of stuff from Bloomburrow. Camellia the Seed Miser is a 3 mana 3/3 menace. Other squirrels you control have menace, and whenever you sacrifice 1 or more foods, you get to create a 1/1 squirrel creature token. Hazel's Brewmaster is a 4 mana 3/4 menace. Whenever it enters or attacks, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard and create a food token. And foods you control have all activated abilities of all creature cards exiled with Hazel's Brewmaster. A card that has already gotten a mention is Igra Eater of All, which turns all other creatures into food. So very easy to see how this slots into a Greta deck. There is the famous combo of Witch's Oven and Cauldron Familia, which pairs a 1 mana artifact that sacrifices a creature to create a food token, with a creature that can sacrifice a food token to come back from the graveyard. Feasting Troll King is maybe a bigger variant of a creature like this. You can either play it fair for 6 mana and get a Vigilance Trample 7/6 that comes with 3 food tokens if it entered from your hand, or if it's in your graveyard, you can sacrifice 3 foods and return it from your graveyard to the battlefield. As this card is from Eldraine, it might be worth to take a look at more Eldraine cards like Gilded Goose, which is just, a good 1 mana ramp. Gingerbread Cabin as a food maker that is fetchable in the land base. Nutrient Block is a suggestion from a viewer during the live stream, so again, check it out. It's from Edges of Eternity, a 1 mana artifact. It's a food, indestructible. For 2 mana, you can sacrifice this artifact and get through life, and should it be put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you draw a card. So you could theoretically sacrifice it to Greta to draw 2 cards and only lose 1 life for that. Another very famous food maker combo is the Underworld Cookbook. For 1 mana, you can discard a card and create a food with Oval Chase Daredevil, a 4 mana creature that whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you can return from your graveyard to your hand. There is so many more cards to talk about when it comes to food. I'm just gonna mention 2 more. Jaheira, Friend of the Forest, which is a 3 mana 2/3 that you should consider whenever you're making a bunch of tokens, because it gives tokens you control the ability to tap for green. An even more perfect fit for a Greta Sweet Tooth deck is Knight of Sweet's Revenge, a 4 mana enchantment that when it enters, you get to create a food token. It also gives your foods the ability to tap for green, but even better, for 7 mana and sacrificing it, creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of foods you control. You can only activate this as a sorcery speed overrun effect. But let's move on to a much less tasty card. Grismold the Dreadsower is a 3 mana 3/3 Troll Shaman. It has Trample, and at the beginning of your end step, each player creates a 1/1 green plant creature token. Whenever a creature token dies, put a +1/+1 counter on Grismold the Dreadsower. If you read the line, creature dies, especially creature opponent dies, think Forbidden. This guy specifically cares about creature tokens, and there is so many good things that make creature tokens. A Crowan Horse might not be the best card, but it's a nice role player here, where you play it for 4, you give it to an opponent, and then during your upkeep, each opponent creates a 1/1 white soldier creature token. You give it to player A, and then players B, C, and D, one of them being you, gets a 1/1 white soldier token. That makes 3 creature tokens per turn that can die. The Hunted cycle of Hunted Bone Brute and Hunted Troll both make 1/1 creature tokens that are very easy to kill. Turntimber Soa is a 3 mana 3/3 that whenever 1 or more land cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere, you get to create a 0/1 green plant creature token. And for 1 green and sacrificing 3 creatures, you get to return target land card from your graveyard to your hand. On the topic of plant tokens, Avenger of Zendikar is a classic. A 7 mana 5/5 that comes with as many 0/1 green plant creature tokens as you have lands. And then whenever you play a land, you may put a +1/+1 counter on each plant creature token you control. A 2 mana enchantment that makes plants is Insidious Roots. Creature tokens you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color. Already great. And whenever 1 or more creature cards leave your graveyard, create a 0/1 green plant creature token. Then put a +1/+1 counter on each plant you control. But how do we effectively kill all those tokens? There is effects like Knight of Soul's Betrayal, a 4 mana enchantment that simply gives all creatures -1/-1. You could tap your Forbidden Orchard and the token would just immediately die to an effect like this. But we can get more efficient because Grismold specifically cares about tokens. Engineer Plague makes it so you choose a creature type and all creatures of the chosen type get -1/-1. At 3, that's quite good on rate. Pair this with Forbidden Orchard, choose Spirit, you have a repeatable effect. But we can get even more efficient because for 1 mana, Illness in the Ranks is an enchantment that continuously gives creature tokens -1/-1. That counts for your own tokens and accounts for opponents. If you want to be really nasty, you can pair one of those more generic -1/-1 effects with Life and Limb, a 4 mana enchantment that turns all forests into 1/1 green sprawling creatures. If you play a Yavimaya, you can turn all your opponent's lands into forests. And if you give all forest 1/1 creatures -1/-1, well then suddenly no one has lands anymore. All that will be left is a gigantic Grismold that tramples over its opposition. Grist Voracious Lava is a 1 mana commander, which is already quite interesting in and of itself. It is a 1/2 Death Touch, so it trades out quite nicely, but that's not exactly what your commander should do. Whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it entered from your graveyard or you cast it from your graveyard, you may pay 1 green. If you do, exile Grist and then return it to the battlefield transformed under its owner's control. What does it transform into? It transforms into Grist the Plague Swarm, a planeswalker with 3 loyalty. For +1, you get to create a 1/1 black and green insect creature token. Then you mill 2 cards and put a death touch counter on the tokens if a black card was milled this way. For -2, you get to destroy target artifact or enchantment, which is quite nice as those are very prevalent in Commander. And for -6, for each creature card in your graveyard, you get to create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a 1/1 black and green insect. So here we go back to self-mill, Stitch's Supplier, one of the most efficient cards to self-mill. We go back to the insects. So Archik Emerald Radiant, a 6-mana 3/3. When it enters, create a 1/1 green insect creature token for each artifact or creature card in your graveyard. Pairs quite nicely with self-mill and insects. And whenever another insect you control dies, you can put a +1/+1 counter on it, and each opponent loses 1 life. You can of course also play the real Grist. Grist in the graveyard is a creature, which means you get a 1/1 token copy of it, which is definitely not a rules nightmare for some people. 3 mana planeswalker while it's on the battlefield that creates more insects, destroys creatures or planeswalkers, and drains people for a lot depending on how many cards are in your graveyard. Sir Conrad is always a welcome inclusion, a 5-drop that whenever another creature dies, a creature card is put into a graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, or a creature card leaves your graveyard, deals 1 to each opponent. It can also mill, which works nicely with Grist's ultimate ability. And now we only need to think of 2 more things. How do we get to turn our measly 1 mana 1/2 death touch into Grist the Plague Swarm? And which type of creatures are we playing to get the most of the -6 ability? Let's start with the things we play to enable our Grist. Bloodghast. Very simple, a 2 mana 2/1 that comes back from your graveyard whenever a land enters under your control. Ichorid is a 4 mana 3/1 haste. At the beginning of your end step, you sacrifice it. At the beginning of your upkeep, if Ichorid is in your graveyard, you can exile another black creature card from your graveyard, and if you do, return Ichorid to the battlefield. This is a very nice, repeatable effect of how to transform Grist the Voracious Lava into Grist the Plague Swarm. There's multiple cards like this, but let's move on to the creatures we are looking to reanimate with its ult. Whenever I find an effect that effectively copies a card, I look for A, strong ETBs. We don't get cast triggers, but we still get ETBs. And I look for additional casting costs, because some creatures are balanced around you not only paying mana, but also paying in a different kind of way. Archon of Cruelty is perhaps one of the best examples of a really good ETB. For 8 mana, you get a 6/6 flying, and when it enters or attacks target opponent, sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, discards a card, loses 3 life, and you draw a card and gain 3 life. This is very nice as an ETB. It is a repeatable effect that even on a 1/1 black and green insect is quite powerful. And if we're looking for additional casting costs, Arbiter of Woe and Dusk Mangler are quite expensive in mana cost, but also in their additional casting cost, as for Arbiter of Woe, you need to sacrifice a creature, which isn't always the easiest. For Dusk Mangler, not only do you need to sacrifice a creature, you also need to discard a card or pay for life. But the payoff you get is quite nice. For the 6 mana Arbiter, when this creature enters, each opponent discards a card, loses 2 life, and you draw a card and gain 2 life. For Dusk Mangler, when it enters, each opponent sacrifices a creature, discards a card, and loses 4 life. We really do get to cheat on these additional costs, but even if they are in your hand, I think Grist is the kind of commander that enables their normal casting ways quite nicely. There's also Torgar Famine Incarnate, an 8 mana 7/6, where as additional cost, you may sacrifice any number of creatures, and Torgar costs 2 less to cast for each creature sacrificed this way. In a deck where the commander repeatedly creates 1/1s, should be quite castable. But even if we cheat it into play, when Torgar enters, choose up to 1 target player whose life total becomes half their starting life total rounded down. You could play this like in Hearthstone, the good old Alistrasa, to heal you up to half your starting life total, but usually this is going to mean doming someone for 20 if you're playing against a life gain deck, up to, incredible numbers of -40 life or something like that. That was quite exhausting, wasn't it? So it's time for a lunch break. Food again? Food again. Guillaume Master Chef is a 4 mana 5/3 troll warlock that has trample. At the beginning of your end step, create a number of food tokens equal to the number of non-token creatures you had enter the battlefield under your control this turn. For 1 mana and sacrificing a food, target creature gains indestructible until end of turn and you tap it. This, in a weird way, reminds me of a much more powerful card in Koma Cosmos Serpent, a 7-drop that is a 6/6 that can't be counted, and at the beginning of each upkeep, you get to create a 3/3 blue serpent creature token named Koma's Coil. Then you can sacrifice a serpent to either tap target permanent, it loses all its activated abilities, or to give Koma indestructible until the end of turn. The way this plays out is Koma is very hard to remove, and it's also very difficult to attack the player who has Koma out, so player removal also doesn't work. Guillaume works kind of similar, because for 1 mana sacrificing a food, you can make it indestructible, you can make your enablers indestructible, or you can tap down opposing threats that are potentially threatening your life. If you see food, you automatically have to think stuff like Jaheira, Friend of the Forest, and Knight of Sweet's Revenge, who already got their mention. Gingerbread Cabin auto include. Witch's Oven, Cauldron Familia, probably also in your deck, as it is a way to always have at least 1 non-token creature enter the battlefield under your control. You could go infinite with some Beledros, Witherbloom, Temur, Sabertooth shenanigans, so really Guillaume shows that all the work we've done so far has been worth it. A fresh new card that I want to mention is Mazarek Crawl Deathpriest, 5 mana 2/2 flying from Edges of Eternity. Whenever a player sacrifices another permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. This can go quite silly with Guillaume Master Chef, because remember, Guillaume kind of gives all of your creatures indestructible at a whim. A card that got a boost from the recent Lorwyn Eclipsed set is Hapatra Vizier of Poisons, a 2 mana 2/2 human cleric. Whenever Hapatra deals combat damage to a player, you may put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. But more importantly, whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on a creature, well, you get to create a 1/1 green snake creature token with Death Touch. There is so much synergy and so many ways to build around this deck. As we've already mentioned, Lorwyn Eclipsed has given this archetype a few new additions. From the commander deck, Them's Aberrant Return, a 6 mana sorcery where you put 1, 2, or 3 target creature cards from any graveyards onto the battlefield under your control, and each of them enters with an additional -1/-1 counter on them. This is not only a standalone powerful card, it also works quite nicely with Hapatra. If we're going back a bit further, from Magic's most spooky set, Dreadtiller is a 3 mana 2/4. When this creature enters, you put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. Whenever a creature with a -1/-1 counter on it dies, you can put a land card from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield tapped. There is more sets that provide synergy, especially if we're looking at Old Lorwyn. Blowfly Infestation is a 3 mana enchantment, and whenever a creature is put into a graveyard from play, if they had a -1/-1 counter on it, put a -1/-1 counter on target creature. This immediately can create infinite creature die triggers and creature enter triggers with Hapatra, because you put a -1/-1 counter on one of your 1/1 green snake creature tokens, subsequently creating a 1/1 snake from Hapatra. Crumbling Ashes is a 2 mana enchantment that simply destroys a creature with a -1/-1 counter on it during every one of your upkeeps. Devoted Druid is interesting because it can go infinite if you manage to balance out the fact that it puts -1/-1 counters on itself to untap it. Necro Skitter got a much needed reprint. It is a 3 mana 1/4 elemental that deals damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters, and whenever a creature an opponent controls with a -1/-1 counter on it dies, you can return that card to the battlefield under your control. Nest of Scarabs, another enchantment, 3 mana. Whenever you put 1 or more -1/-1 counters on a creature, create that many 1/1 black insect creature tokens. There is 2 more cards that I want to mention that are great. Persist might be the single best reanimation spell for a Hapatra deck, because for 2 mana, you get to return target non-legendary creature from your graveyard to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it, thus triggering Hapatra. And Massacre Girl, Known Killer, is an extremely powerful payoff for removing creatures with -1/-1 counters. It is a 4 mana 4/4. It has menace, and creatures you control have wither, thus dealing damage to creatures in the form of -1/-1 counters. The kicker: whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, if its toughness was less than 1, aka if it died to -1/-1 counters, you draw a card. Hazel of the Root Bloom is a 4 mana 3/5 squirrel druid that takes a bit of a different approach to the whole food, token, squirrel shenanigans. When you tap it and pay to life, and tap X untapped tokens you control, you add X mana in any combination of colors to your mana pool. At the beginning of your end step, create a token that's a copy of target token you control. If that token is a squirrel, instead create 2 tokens that are copies of it. So, Hazel cares about big tokens. Yes, you could be making many small 1/1 squirrel tokens, but really what we want to do here is create very effective large tokens. There is different ways to do this. Let's get the obvious out of the way. Jaheira for the Forest, Knight of Swiss Revenge. Yes, you are included, you're very welcome. Food is quite easy to make, and Academy Manufacturer, for example, is a grandiose card if you create a lot of food tokens anyways. Now we are looking for ways to create very good, high-valued tokens, and there is a bunch of those. Abyssal Harvester, very interestingly, is a 3 mana 3/2 Demon Warlock. You can simply tap it and exile target creature card from a graveyard that was put there this turn. It doesn't specify from where. Then you create a token that's a copy of it, except it's a nightmare in addition to its other types. Then, as a safety valve, you exile all other nightmare tokens you control. Tap this once though, and the damage might already be done, because from there on out, Hazel can take the wheel. Bramble Sovereign is a 4 mana 4/4, and whenever another non-token creature enters the battlefield, you can pay 2. If you do, that creature's controller creates a token that's a copy of that creature. You could be nice to your opponents and give them more creatures. You could also just use this for yourself. God's Pharaoh Gift is quite a well-known card. 7 mana, it's an artifact. At the beginning of combat on your turn, you exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that card, except it's also a 4/4 black zombie. That creature gains haste until end of turn. Dual Nature adds to the pile of good token makers. 6 mana, whenever a creature card comes into play, its controller puts a creature token into play that's a copy of that creature. Whenever a creature card leaves the play, remove all tokens with the same name as that creature. When Dual Nature leaves play, remove all tokens created with it from the game. Now this is more symmetrical, but I'm sure you'll get the most out of it. The last card I want to mention is kind of the perfect fit. Again, a suggestion from chat. Formless Genesis. For just 3 mana, you get a Kindred sorcery, a Kindred Shapeshifter sorcery, which means it has a Changeling ability, making it every creature type in the game. The effect creates an XX colorless shapeshifter creature token with Changeling and Death Touch, where X is the number of land cards in your graveyard. And even better, it has Retrace, so you may cast this card from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to paying its other mana cost. What's so great about this is it does create a huge, a gigantic squirrel token, and thus Hazel can create 2 copies. A modern nightmare is Hogaak Arisen Necropolis. It's a 7 mana 8/8 avatar. You cannot spend mana to cast this spell. Well, how do you cast it then? It has Convoke and Delve. Convoke meaning you can tap creatures to help cast it, and Delve meaning you can exile cards from your graveyard to pay at least for the generic cost. I imagine this to be one of the most degenerate self-mill strategies out there. You want to, as quickly as possible, fill up your graveyard to pay for the generic cost. You do need to remember to play creatures as well, because only the Convoke can pay for the colored mana in Hogaak's mana cost. Then it becomes about turning a quote-unquote 0 mana 8/8 into something valuable. Because let's face it, even if you play this on turn 2, which is possible but very difficult, an 8/8 in Commander, even with Trample, on turn 2 often just doesn't cut it. People are playing their Ongifies, their Path to Exiles, their Swords to Plowshares, so you need to find some other way to make good use of it. But let's talk enablers first. Stitcher Supplier is great. It adds 3 cards immediately to the graveyard, and it taps to cast Hogaak. Golgari Grave Troll is one of the most degenerate enablers of graveyard strategy in general, because once it's in your graveyard, instead of drawing a card, you can mill 6 cards and return Golgari Grave Troll to your hand. Should you have a way to discard it again, you can rinse and repeat this effect over and over again. It has other text, but nobody cares about, but it really does. Jared, Golgari Lich Lord, is a 4-mana 2/2 that gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard. For 1, a black and a green, you can sacrifice another creature, and each opponent loses life equal to the sacrificed creature's power. This quite nicely makes use of Hogaak's 8's power. What's even better is, Hogaak kind of gets around command text, so you can do this multiple times per turn if you have enough mana. Lastly, by sacrificing a swamp and a forest, you can return Jared from your graveyard to your hand. An effect like this is always extremely nice, because you are looking to mill yourself anyways. If you have cards in your graveyard that can do something from that zone, you should definitely be considering it. What do you do with an 8/8 if you're not sacrificing it to Jared? You're probably sacrificing it to stuff like Life's Legacy, which is a 2-mana sorcery that draws a card equal to the sacrificed creature's power. You're sacrificing it to the Greater Good, which is probably not something that Hogaak would have expected from its life. It's a 4-mana enchantment. You sacrifice a creature, you draw cards equal to the sacrificed creature's power, and then you discard 3 cards. This is of course perfect because you get to draw 8 cards, then you discard the 3 worst ones, and those 3 cards can help cast Hogaak again. Quite similarly, Altar of the Wretched is a perfect fit. 3-mana artifact. When it enters, you may sacrifice a non-token Hogaak. If you do, draw X cards, then mill X cards, where X is the creature's power. So, you draw X, which is 8, and then you mill 8, and those 8 can more than cover Hogaak's generic mana cost for the next time you cast it from your graveyard. Yes, what's extra nice about Hogaak is you can cast it from your graveyard. There is one more type of card that I want to talk about when it comes to Hogaak. Normally, in a game of Commander, you would be sending Hogaak to the graveyard as often as possible. This is, of course, to get around the increasing commander tax that would be put on it if you were putting it back into the command zone. There is one type of card, though, that takes advantage of you casting your commander over and over again. Myth Unbound is a 3-mana enchantment, and your commander costs 1 less to cast for each time it's been cast from the command zone, kind of mitigating the command text. And whenever your commander is put into the command zone from anywhere, you get to draw a card. Even more of a payoff is Skull Storm, a 9-mana sorcery, and when you cast this spell, you copy it for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game. The effect? Each opponent sacrifices a creature. Each opponent who can't loses half their life rounded up. Depending on how aggressively you've been recasting Hogaak from the command zone, this could end up being a board clear that drains the entire table for a bunch of life. I am not sure if the tension of putting Hogaak back into the command zone and thus making it more expensive to cast is disqualifying these cards from your deck. I'd certainly be curious to see how well this kind of effect plays in a Hogaak deck that so aggressively cheats on mana cost. Next in line is a Filthy Liar. Liar? Why would I call Honest Rutstein a liar? Well, because he's anything but honest. It's a 3-mana 3/2. When it enters, return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. What am I saying? That is quite fair, isn't it? Well, but creature spells you cast cost 1 less to cast. And that is a line that I've never seen do fair things in Magic. A kind of fair way to play this is to pair Honest Rutstein with a bunch of 1-drop ramp spells. You play your Fyndhorn Elf on 1, you play your Honest Rutstein on 2. Next turn you will have 3 lands, a Fyndhorn Elf, and the effect of Honest Rutstein, and you can then play a bunch of very good 5-drops. Defiler of Vigor is a 5-mana Phyrexian Worm. It's a 6/6, it has trample, and whenever you cast a green permanent spell, you can pay 2 life, and those spells will then cost 1 green less. And whenever you cast a green permanent spell, you get to put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control. This would pair quite nicely with all future Fyndhorn Elves type cards in your deck. Drivnot Carnage Dominus is a 5-mana 8/3. If a creature dying causes a triggered ability of a permanent you control to trigger, that ability triggers an additional time. For 2 Phyrexian mana and exiling 3 creature cards from your graveyard, you can put an indestructible counter on Drivnot. Now this is one way you could be playing this commander. But when I see a card like this, I'm thinking combo. Now this might be very me-coded, but this effect reminds me a bit of Heartless Summoning, a very neat 2-mana enchantment that makes it so creature spells you cast cost 2 less to cast. As a downside, creatures you control get -1/-1. Again, you could be playing a card like this to play your Defiler of Vigors, your Drivnaughts cheaper. You could also be playing it with Mirror Retriever, a 2-mana 1/1 that when it dies, you return another target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. But wouldn't that Mirror Retriever die immediately? Well, yes, that's exactly what we're doing here. Mirror Retriever and Scrap Trawler very famously go infinite quite quickly with cards like Heartless Summoning, or cards like Krark Clan Ironworks, which sacrifices an artifact to add 2 mana to your mana pool. If you have Honest Rutstein out, Mirror Retriever costs 1, Scrap Trawler costs 2, so every cycle of returning Scrap Trawler with Mirror Retriever and returning Mirror Retriever with Scrap Trawler adds a bunch of mana to your mana pool. What you do with infinite mana? Certainly not honest things. I don't have much to say about the next one. Izoni Center of Web is a 6-mana 5/4 elf detective. It has Menace. Whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, you may collect evidence 4. If you do, create 2 2/1 black and green spider creature tokens with Menace and Reach. You can sacrifice 4 tokens to surveil 2 and draw 2 cards and gain 2 life. The second line of text is very good, but you could be sacrificing any kinds of tokens. So what do we do with Collect Evidence 4? As a reminder, collecting Evidence 4 means you need to exile cards from your graveyard with combined mana value of 4 or greater from your graveyard to trigger this effect. There is ways to go about this. What I want to talk about though is split cards. We've seen a bunch of split cards over the years. There's the Aftermath cards. There is the normal split cards like Find and Finality. And quite recently we also got Room cards that are enchantment, so permanent spells that have 2 sides to them. When looking at these cards in a zone other than the battlefield or the stack, you need to combine the mana value of both sides to find out its true current mana value. This means even though Find is only 2 mana and Finality is, well, admittedly 6, this card in your graveyard will count as mana value 8. It's a very nice way to have cheap cards in your deck that act as if they were very expensive cards for an effect like Izoni's. There's other commanders that care about high mana value, so I'm sure some of you have some use for this type of information. Imaren of Clan Neltoth is a 4-mana 3/4 human shaman, and whenever another creature you control dies, you get an experience counter. At the beginning of your end step, choose target creature card in your graveyard. If that creature card's mana value is less than or equal to the number of experience counters on you, you can return it to the battlefield. If it is not, you return it to your hand. There is not too much to say about this. Experience counters are counters that are almost impossible to interact with for others. For you though, you quite literally only need to proliferate them. I mean, making a bunch of creatures die is not particularly difficult in black. Viscera Seer is a great sacrifice outlet. Cankerbloom is a wonderfully flexible creature that not only destroys an artifact or enchantment in a pinch, it can also proliferate, serving double duty of dying to give you an experience counter, but also proliferating said experience counters. Plaguemaw Beast might not be the best card on its own, but as a 5-mana card that sacrifices a creature to proliferate, it does what Cankerbloom does repeatedly every turn. Staff of Completion we've already mentioned. It destroys target permanent you control, making creatures die. It also proliferates. Perfect inclusion. What are you getting back? I don't know. Champion of Stray Souls is a 6-mana card that sacrifices a bunch of creatures, so again it plays this double role of then it returns a bunch of creature cards from your graveyard to the battlefield. Magus of the Mirror, 6-mana 4/2, you can sacrifice it to exchange life totals with target opponent. There's so many things you could be getting back with Marin that it kind of doesn't make sense for me to pick out certain creatures. Nath of the Guiltleaf is a 5-mana 4/4 elf warrior. At the beginning of your upkeep, you may have target opponent discard a card at random. Whenever an opponent discards a card, you may put a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token into play. The first thing that came to mind when I saw Nath of the Guiltleaf is, wow, this is kind of archaic. We don't really see random discard effects anymore. Yes, in very early Magic, Hymn to Tourach used to be a very common effect. 2 black, sorcery, target player discards 2 cards at random. Nowadays, Wizards has realized that discarding cards at random is kinda toxic and feels pretty bad. So creatures like Hypnotic Spectre, 3 mana 2/2 flying, when it hits someone, they discard a card at random. They've kind of been discontinued. We still get these cards from time to time. Mind Shatter is not terribly old. It's a 2 black and X sorcery where target player discards X cards at random. And we've seen the namesake of him to Turok. Turok himself, the Dread Cantor, in a Modern Horizons set. For 2 mana, you get a 2/1, protection from white. Whenever an opponent discards a card, put a +1/+1 counter on Turok. The kicker? Well, if you kick it for 2 black mana, you him to Turok someone, making an opponent discard 2 cards at random. How do we make use of such an obscure ability? One thing that came to my mind is that it can sometimes be an advantage to have someone discard a card at random rather than choosing a card in their hand. Waste Not is a 2 mana enchantment. Whenever an opponent discards a creature card, create a 2/2 black zombie creature token. Whenever an opponent discards a land, you get 2 mana to your mana pool, and whenever an opponent discards a non-creature, non-land card, you draw a card. Lands are notoriously difficult to make someone discard, but Nath does not care, he does not discriminate. So the rate with which you will get mana from Waste Not on Nath of the Guildleaf is quite a lot higher than what you would get from other commanders, which is very nice. There is also a bunch of creatures that make use of Nath caring about discard on one hand, and also making creature tokens on discard. Cabal Therapy is a legacy staple. For 1 black mana, you name a non-land card. Target player reveals his or her hand and discards all cards with that name. Now, of course, in Commander, usually that means you only get a 1/1. If you don't know what they have in hand, well, sometimes you even 0/1 yourself. And how would you know what they have in hand? After all, Nath doesn't look at their hand, he discards at random. Well, thankfully you get a second shot, because Cabal Therapy has Flashback, where you sacrifice a creature. Well, this means on the first cast of Cabal Therapy, if you hit and make an opponent discard a card, Nath will trigger and give you a 1/1 green elf warrior creature token. You will now have seen what your opponent has in their hand, and by sacrificing the 1/1 green elf creature token you just created, you get to take a second card, and even get to replace the elf warrior creature token. And lastly, Mind Slash is just a wonderful enchantment for a Nath of the Guildleaf deck. For 3 mana, you get an enchantment, 1 black, and sacrifice a creature, look at target opponent's hand and choose a card from it. That player discards that card, you can only play this as a sorcery as a safety valve. So this does kind of what Cabal Therapy does once, but repeatedly. And thankfully, Nath of the Guildleaf will always provide those creatures you so desperately desire to sacrifice to Mind Slash. One last note, making people discard is a crime. Not just, in an abstract sense, it is quite literally, in the sake of the Magic rules, a crime. So cards like Free Strider Lookout and Kurvek the Punisher, who both care about you committing crimes, should be inclusions in Nath of the Guildleaf decks. Halloween is long gone, but Rentmaw Creaking Nest does its best to uphold the scary season. For 5 mana, you get a 5/5 Scarecrow. It has Menace and Reach because it's a Scarecrow. And when it enters, and whenever you play a card with 2 or more card types, each player creates a tapped 2/2 black bird creature token with flying. Those tokens are goaded for the rest of the game. So here, again, we have the clause of you having a lot of types on single cards. So let's go through all the things you can put in your deck that have multiple types. We don't need to go far, because from the same set, we get the very strong and admittedly very expensive enchantment creatures that are the Overlords. Overlord of the Hauntwoods stands as a representative for all of these cards. For 5 mana, you get a 6/5, but you can also pay 3 and have it enter as an enchantment that isn't a creature. Whenever it enters or attacks, you create a tapped colorless land token named Everywhere, that is, every basic land type. Very important here, it is an enchantment creature. And there's a bunch of enchantment creatures. I believe Shigeki Jukai Visionary to be a perfect inclusion for your Rentmaw deck. It is a 2 mana creature that triggers Rentmaw because it is an enchantment creature, but even better, for 2 mana and tapping it, and also returning it to your hand, you reveal 4 cards from your library and put a land card from among them onto the battlefield. The rest goes to your graveyard. why this is so good is because it repeatedly triggers Rentmaw. Every turn, you can return Shigeki to your hand and replay it for 2 mana and trigger Rentmaw's ability. There's more cards like Enduring Vitality or Enduring Tenacity that are very good enchantment creatures that have nice synergy with Rentmaw. There's also, of course, artifact creatures, and there's a million of them. The Swarm Weaver is a scarecrow, so I chose it for thematic reasons, but really, you don't need to look that deep to find good artifact creatures. For mana 2/3, it's a scarecrow. When it enters, you create 2 1/1 black and green insect creature tokens with flying, and it has Delirium as long as there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyards. Insects and spiders you control get +1/+1 and have Death Touch. Cards that also always have 2 types are the Kindred, or formerly Tribal cards. Bitter Blossom is a tribal enchantment. Firedog is a Kindred artifact. Lignify is a tribal enchantment. Nameless Inversion is a tribal instant. All of these cards are good on their own, and they have the nice upside of triggering your Rentmaw. But we can do even better, even simpler, even cheaper, because Rentmaw specifically cares about you playing a card, not about you casting a card. And by now, there is quite a few lands that are also artifacts in addition to their other types. Darkmoor's Bridge is a tapped land, it's indestructible. Most importantly, it's an artifact land. Of course, there's the OG Mirrodin lands of Tree of Tales and Vault of Whispers that you can play in your Rentmaw deck. And just for free, as a land drop, trigger it, get those 2/2 Blackbird creature tokens that are goated for the rest of the game, and enjoy life as a scarecrow so scary that all of these birds can do nothing but attack each other's controllers. Sapling of Kolthanor is a 5 mana 2/5 Treefolk Shaman. It's indestructible, which is one of the best things a commander can be. Whenever it attacks, you reveal the top card of your library. Then, if it's a creature card, you gain life equal to the card's toughness, and you lose life equal to the creature's power. Then you put it into your hand. This might not be the best tribal commander for a Treefolk deck. This might not be the best card advantage commander, but it sits in this niche that I find incredibly interesting. First of all, we have a commander that cares about the difference between a creature's power and a creature's toughness. Second of all, we have a commander that can gain you a bunch of life in one shot. It can also lose you a bunch of life in one shot. Whenever I see a card that gains a bunch of life in one shot, think of cards like Sanguine Bond. Of course, whenever you gain life, target opponent loses that much life. Unfortunately, there is not that much more that can make use of these huge chunks of life that Sapling of Kolthanor creates in a nice and creative way. There is Willow Dusk Essence Seer, a 3 mana 3/3 Dryad Druid. For 1 mana and tapping it, you choose another target creature. Then you put a number of +1/+1 counters on it equal to the amount of life you gained this turn or the amount of life you lost this turn, whichever is greater. You only get to activate this as a sorcery. This admittedly isn't perfect because, well, Kolthanor attacks, then you gain a bunch of life, but Willow Dusk, well, you can only activate her ability as a sorcery, so post-combat. It's not perfect, but there's something there. The term difference between power and toughness brought up another card from Tarkir, Jaws of Defeat, a 4 mana enchantment. Whenever a creature you control enters, target opponent loses life equal to the difference between that creature's power and its toughness. Now that is something we can work with. Is there a card that we can use to ensure we always hit a very good, high toughness card? There's multiple cards like this. An example would be Haunted Crossroads. 3 mana enchantment, for 1 black, put target creature card from your graveyard on top of your library. This means if you have some sort of discard to get rid of cards in your hand, or a mill, you can easily set up Sapling of Kolthanor to hit those juicy, high toughness cards. What are those cards? Unhallowed Phalanx is a 5 mana 1/13. Tree of Perdition is a 0/13 that taps to exchange target opponent's life total with this creature's toughness. Tree of Redemption is a 4 mana 0/13 that exchanges your life total with this creature's toughness. And Catapult Fodder might not have an impressive stat line of just 1/5, but at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you have 3 or more creatures that each have toughness greater than their power, you get to transform it. And on the backside, you can pay 3 and tap it and sacrifice another creature to make target opponent lose life equal to the sacrificed creature's power. Of course, if you're into Universes Beyond, we just got maybe the best payoff for a Sapling of Kolthanor deck in the Walls of Ba Sing Se. For 8 mana, the Walls of Ba Sing Se are an artifact creature with Defender, because it's a wall, that gives other permanents you control indestructible. The stat line? 0/30. not 13, 30. So if you have this on top of your library and Sapling of Kolfinor attacks, you gain 30 life. If you have a Jaws of Defeat out and Walls of Ba Sing Se enters, somebody else loses 30 life. And if you have a Catapult Captain and sacrifice the Walls of Ba Sing Se, target opponent loses 30 life. The stat line is just super crazy. I think anyone can see why this is super exciting. Savra, Queen of the Golgari, a 4-mana 2/2 elf shaman, has 2 lines of text. Whenever you sacrifice a black creature, you may pay 2 life. If you do, each other player sacrifices a creature. Also, whenever you sacrifice a green creature, you may gain 2 life. Of course, that means if you sacrifice a green-black creature, both things will happen. These 2 modes were not created equal. Gaining 2 life in Commander is almost meaningless unless you pair it with another good payoff, but making each opponent sacrifice a creature whenever you sacrifice a creature is extremely strong. Of course, since this doesn't specify that it has to be non-token creatures, we are for sure putting a bunch of token makers in our deck. Bitter Bloombearer is the newest version of a Bitter Blossom effect. It's a 2-mana 1/1 flash flying, and at the beginning of your upkeep, you lose 1 life and create a 1/1 blue and black fairy creature token with flying. Blight Mound is an enchantment that gives all your attacking pests +1/+0 and menace. Whenever a non-token creature you control dies, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain 2 life. Of course, pests are pretty much exactly what you want with Savra, so why not play Tend the Pests, a green-black instant, where as an additional cost you sacrifice a creature, and then create X 1/1 black and green pest creature tokens that gain you a life when they die, where X is a sacrificed creature's power. Dina Soul Steeper, a commander that we've already talked about, has very aligning synergies where you can sacrifice stuff, which is of course necessary for you to trigger Savra, but also she benefits off of the life gain that Savra provides. You could be playing Blood Funnel, 2 mana, non-creature spells you cast cost 2 less to play. Whenever you play a non-creature spell, counter that spell unless you sacrifice a creature. This would be great in a green-black Spellslinger deck that creates a bunch of tokens. One of the best cards you could be playing might be Carrion, a 3-mana instant where you sacrifice a creature to put any number of maggot tokens equal to the sacrificed creature's power into play. These are 0/1 black insect tokens. One last note that might be a little unintuitive by today's standards is you actually do need to sacrifice your creatures. This does not trigger off of your creatures dying. So whatever you're planning to do, make sure you don't just kill your creatures, you actually sacrifice them. This next one was quite easy to put together for me, at least in the list, because I already built a deck around it, because I couldn't wait and was so excited. It is Skullbriar, the Walking Grave. 2 mana, black and green, zombie elemental. It's a 1/1 that has haste. Whenever it deals combat damage to a player, put a +1/+1 counter on it. As this is commander, and your commander costs 2 and has haste, you will always be able to trigger this at least once or twice before people actually start playing creatures. What makes this card especially good though is counters remain on Skullbriar as it moves to any zone other than a player's hand or library. So the average removal spells like Path to Exile or board wipes like Blasphemous Act cannot really stop this Walking Grave. It is maybe one of the most pushed +1/+1 Voltron commanders we've seen maybe ever. The challenge here was not to find cards, but rather to cut down the cards that you could potentially play with a commander like this. There is the obvious ones, Hardened Scales, Ozolith, the Shattered Spire, that make it so more counters are placed on the thing you're putting counters on. Loading Zone is a relatively new one for 4 mana. If 1 or more counters would be placed on a creature you control, twice that many counters are put on it instead. Terra Symbiosis from the same set rewards you for putting a bunch of counters on something at the very same time. Let's remember though that it is not just +1/+1 counters that remain on Skullbriar, and by now we have a bunch of things that grant quite useful counters. Slippery Bogbonder is a 4-mana 3/3 flash and hexproof. When it enters the battlefield, you put a hexproof counter on target creature. Then move any number of counters from among creatures you control onto that creature. This is extremely useful because, well, in its base form, Skullbriar has no protection whatsoever. Hexproof already covers a lot of your bases. Skullbriar, coincidentally, is also missing evasion and some form of combat keywords. Why not play a Titanith Rex, which for just 2 mana you can cycle, and whenever you cycle it, you get to put a trample counter on target creature. Similarly, when you exile Quarzy Revenant from your graveyard for 3 mana, you get to put a flying, a death touch counter, and a lifelink counter on target creature. Why stop there? Scavenged Brawler, you can exile for 5 mana from your graveyard and choose target creature. You put 4+1/+1 counters, a flying counter, a vigilance counter, a trample counter, and a lifelink counter on that creature. And that is almost everything you could ever want on a Voltron commander. Flying is good evasion, vigilance makes it so you can attack and still block. Lifelink makes it so it's almost impossible to race you. And trample, well, trample just means they can never jump. There is more keywords that you can give via counters like Death Touch. These counters are relatively common and quite obviously useful, but there is 2 more cards that grant counters that I want to talk about. Let's first talk about Tyrite Sanctum. It's a land, so the cost to putting it into your deck is relatively low. It taps for generic, but for 2 and tapping it, target legendary creature becomes a god in addition to its other types. Put a +1/+1 counter on it. Now that, of course, alone wouldn't be good enough, but for 4 mana, tapping and sacrificing Tyrite Sanctum, you get to put an indestructible counter on target god. This, over a couple of turns, can make it so your Skullbriar will always have an indestructible counter on it, no matter what your opponents are trying to do. In a similar, more janky but also way cooler way, That Which Was Taken, a 5 mana artifact from Kamigawa, taps for 4 mana to put a divinity counter on target permanent other than itself. And each permanent with a divinity counter on it has indestructible. I could talk about a million more of these cards, but let's move on to the next profile of cards. What I like about Skullbriar is it costs 2 mana. Now, yes, I like it because it's very cheap to get from the command zone, but Skullbriar has no issues of going into the graveyard instead of the command zone. And what's very nice about it being a 2 mana card is you can play a bunch of super efficient reanimation spells that can get Skullbriar back for as little as 1 black mana. Unearth returns target creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. Similar, not quite as good, Stir the Grave for 3 mana gets your Skullbriar back into play. You can look at the Verils section of this video to find some more card suggestions when it comes to having a payoff for a large creature like Skullbriar will eventually turn into. Something like Season of Gathering that not only provides a bunch of +1/+1 counters, vigilance and trample, but you can also use some of its modes to draw cards equal to the greatest power among creatures you control. One last card that is super flexible is Cauldron of Souls, a 5 mana artifact that you can tap and choose any number of target creatures. Each of those creatures gain persist until end of turn. That means should it die, if it had no -1/-1 counters on it, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control with a -1/-1 counter on it. This is pretty good with a number of cards, but it's especially good with Skullbriar because Skullbriar will almost always have a +1/+1 counter to go around. Even if you freshly reanimate it from the graveyard or replay it from the command zone, there will be a +1/+1 counter there to have Cauldron of Souls active. The Gitrog monster is a very famous black and green commander, which is why I'm talking about its lesser known variant, the Gitrog Ravenous Ride, which I will continue to call Gitrog monster out of spite and because, well, I genuinely could never unlearn the name. I tried, believe me. The Gitrog monster is a 5-drop. For 3 black and green, you get a Frog Horror mount. It has Trample and Haste, which are great keywords on a commander. It's a 6/5, and the text box, whenever it deals combat damage to a player, you may sacrifice a creature that saddled the Gitrog monster this turn. If you do, draw X cards, then put up to X land cards from your hand onto the battlefield tapped, where X is the sacrificed creature's power. To saddle it, you only need to tap a creature with power 1 or more. My first instinct when I see a commander like this is to think of the ramp curve I want to have in a Gitrog Ravenous Ride deck. The most straightforward way to build a Gitrog Ravenous Ride deck is to play a bunch of 1 mana ramp, a bunch of 3 mana ramp, play Gitrog on turn 3, and start beating the crap out of your opponent while accruing value over time as you're sacrificing creatures to draw cards and get more lands into play. One distinct feature of a Gitrog Ravenous Ride deck, though, is that you shouldn't just play any 1 mana ramp card. In reality, you might still end up playing Fyndhorn Elves, Llanowar Elves, and the likes, but technically you should be focusing on having as many lands as reasonable in your deck, because the Gitrog monster won't do much when drawing into Fyndhorn Elves, whereas it would do a lot when drawing into a bunch of lands that you can then put into play directly. That means suddenly cards like Arboreal Grazer, Elfish Pioneer, or Krosan Wayfarer suddenly become a lot more valuable. These are all cards that benefit from you having a bunch of extra lands in your deck. When choosing 3 mana cards, it's pretty easy pickings. Cards like Dryad of the Elysian Grove follow a similar structure where they reward you for having a bunch of lands, but it's not like Gwenna, Eyes of Gaia, that taps for 2 mana and untaps whenever you cast a creature spell with power 5 or greater is bad. Technically, if you go Elfish Pioneer on 1, Gwenna on turn 2, the next turn you could cast Gitrog, Ravenous Ride, Gwenna untaps once you cast Gitrog, and then you could use Gwenna to saddle the Gitrog, attack, sacrifice Gwenna, draw 2, and potentially ramp 2 more. When I see a strange niche keyword like saddle, I always try to look up synergies within the keyword. I was a bit disappointed to see that only 2 cards I deemed somewhat worth it to play. Caustic Bronco is a 2 mana 2/2. When it attacks, you reveal the top card of your library, put it into your hand, and lose life equal to that card's mana value. So a bit like Bob, as in, it gives you value, but you trade in life. If you saddle it, it has saddle 3. Then instead each opponent loses the life you would lose once you draw the card. In a deck that is as low to the ground as the Gitrog, I probably wouldn't bother saddling this at all. You will have a bunch of 1 mana ramp, a bunch of 3 mana ramps, and a bunch of lands on average. But it is not a bad card, and if you want to play more saddle cards, it's one of 2 that I would suggest for sure. The other one being Ornery Tumblewag, a 3 mana 2/2. At the beginning of combat on your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. And whenever Ornery Tumblewag attacks while it's saddled, double the number of +1/+1 counters on target creature. You could put all the +1/+1 counters on Ornery Tumblewag and then later on sacrifice it to the Gitrog Ravenous Ride to get a bunch of draw triggers and put lands into play. Outside of the obvious synergies, I tried looking at cards that are high statted, low mana cost, so you can get them out quickly, that you can sacrifice to the Gitrog efficiently. Archfiend of Dross is not insane when it comes to its stats, but it is a 4 mana 6/6, a 4 mana 6/6 that will lose you the game eventually, but you are hoping to sacrifice it to the Gitrog quite early on. Similarly, Damogoth Woe Eater is a 4 mana 7/6 that makes you sacrifice a creature at the beginning of your upkeep. When you sacrifice Damogoth Woe Eater though, each opponent discards a card, you draw a card, and you gain 2 life. Seeing as it also has a 7/6 stat line, you would be drawing quite a lot of cards if you sacrifice this Woe Eater to the Gitrog Ravenous Ride. Outside of that, I think Landfall is an obviously adjacent keyword. Bristly Bill Spinesower is admittedly very expensive, but you know, you could just proxy it always. It's a 2 mana 2/2 landfall. You put a +1/+1 counter on target creature, and for 5 mana, you can double the number of +1/+1 counters on each creature you control. Mossborn Hydra follows a similar strategy. 3 mana, it has trample and enters with a +1/+1 counter on it. Whenever a land enters, double the number of +1/+1 counters on this creature. There's 2 more cards that I want to talk about. The first one is not even adjacent to the Gitrog, but adjacent to a lot of the cards that you will be playing. If you want to ramp on 1, you will be playing a bunch of elves. Elfish Pioneer, Fyndhorn Elves, Llanowar Elves, Mystic something. All of these are elves. So you could be playing Diona's Elfish Archdruid, a 4-mana 3/3 elf druid. It reads, elves you control have, whenever this creature becomes tapped during your turn, untap it, put a +1/+1 counter on it. This ability triggers only once each turn. I believe this to be like an almost exceptional card in a Gitrog deck. You have these elves that tap for mana, or that saddle the Gitrog. That means you could tap them for mana, they untap, you tap them to saddle the Gitrog, and then you sacrifice them. It could also mean you tap them to saddle the Gitrog, and they are still there to block or chump block opposing creatures. And it also means, since they get +1/+1 counters, that they will draw you more cards down the line should you actually sacrifice them to the Gitrog. Lastly, whenever I see the keyword saddle or the more popular variant crew, I also keep an eye out on things that want to get tapped. Now, I didn't find a card that wants to be untapped that was particularly good. I did find one that wants to be untapped though. King Makkar, the Gold Cursed, is a 4-mana 2/3. It has Inspired, so that's something that you could look up. Whenever it becomes untapped, you may exile target creature. If you do, put a colorless artifact token named Gold onto the battlefield. It has sacrifice this artifact, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. Let's dissect this card a little. First of all, you don't get treasures, you get gold. Gold has the advantage of not needing to be tapped to add mana. Even if somebody has a stacks effect that makes your artifacts enter tapped, these are still readily available. Also, quite untypical for an effect like this, these creatures that you exile with King Makkar are never coming back, even if King Makkar dies. Why do I think this card is especially suited for the Gitrog? Well, this is a 4-mana 2/3 that wants to be untapped. Typically, the way to tap a creature, and consequently untap it, is by attacking. But with a stat line like this, it is completely unsuited for battle. That means it benefits a lot from a free tapping, like riding the Gitrog into battle, without actual danger of dying. So, should you be building a Gitrog deck, maybe look out for more cards with the Inspired keyword. Let's move on to a typal strategy in the Micro Tyrant. It is a 3-mana star with Trample. Its power and toughness are each equal to the number of creatures you control that are fungi and or Saprolinx. At the beginning of your end step, create X 1/1 black fungus creature tokens with this creature can't block. X is the number of times you descended this turn. Now, descend is a relatively new keyword. It reads, you descend each time a permanent card is put into your graveyard from anywhere. Now, first things first, we need to talk about how tokens are not actual cards. So you can't trigger descend by sacrificing tokens. You need to find some other ways. What are these ways? Whenever I think Self-Mill, I think Mesmeric Orb, the 2-mana artifact that makes it so whenever a permanent becomes untapped, no matter if it's an opponent's permanent or your permanent, that permanent's controller puts the top card of their library into their graveyard. This is a great way to just start accruing graveyard size starting turn 2. When you think Self-Mill, you also think Dredge. We've talked about Golgari Grave Troll, Stinkweed Imp, Darkmoor Salvage do a very similar thing. Altar of Dementia is an all-star great artifact where for 2 mana, you can repeatedly sacrifice creatures to mill as many cards as the creature had power. Sir Conrad, also always a staple. Now, what makes the Micro Tyrant special is that technically it cares about typal synergies. Unfortunately, if we're looking at the type of creature types it cares about, these are just pretty horrendous. Yes, there's Spore Crown Thalid, a 2-mana 2/2 that gives each other fungus or Saproling +1/+1, but really that's a pretty mid effect if we're looking at other lords that come at a 2 cost. You could be playing very efficient cards like Insidious Fungus, a 1-mana 1/2 that for 2 mana you can sacrifice to either destroy an artifact, destroy an enchantment, or to draw a card and then put a land card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped. Now these are good cards either on their own or specifically in a Micro Tyrant deck. If you want to build a relatively good deck, you probably won't be playing many more of these creatures. There is a Molder Hulk, which is always a decent inclusion if you're milling yourself a bunch. It is a 9 mana creature with 7 generic cost, but it costs 1 less for each creature card in your graveyard. And when it enters, you also get to return target land card from your graveyard to the battlefield. We've also talked about this a little on a different commander, but when you're milling yourself, try to include cards that actually do something from the graveyard. A very popular example is the Dread Return card, which is a 4 mana sorcery that returns target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It has flashback, and the flashback is actually just sacrificing 3 creatures, a card built for a commander that creates a bunch of 1/1 tokens. Lastly, a bit of a pet card of mine is Brackish Trudge. It's a 3 mana 4/2, it enters tapped, but for 2 mana you get to return it from your graveyard to your hand, but only if you gain life this turn. Now in green and black, I assume it's going to be pretty easy for you to gain life, and then if you have a way to discard this from your hand, which also isn't the most difficult thing in a black and green deck, then you can use Brackish Trudge to just repeatedly descend, because descend doesn't care where the permanent came from. Well, it just cares about it ending up in your graveyard. Valentine, Dean of the Vein, is a 1 mana 1/1 vampire warlock. It has menace and lifelink, and if a non-token creature an opponent controls would die, exile it instead. If you do, you may pay 2 generic. If you do, create a 1/1 black and green pest creature token with, when this creature dies, you gain a life. Now this is a pretty inefficient hate piece that doesn't really do anything to further your own strategy. Thankfully, you don't actually plan on casting it because it has a better side. Its backside. Lisette, Dean of the Root, is a 4 mana 4/4. It's a human druid, and whenever you gain life, you may pay 1. If you do, put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, and those creatures gain trample until end of turn. I think I've mentioned this before in the video that whenever a card cares about life gain, you need to differentiate between gaining a bunch of small increments of life versus gaining huge increments of life at the same time. This card, Lisette, of course, cares about you gaining a bunch of life, which is often the easier way. All-star staples in a strategy like this are Essence Warden and now the new card Virulent Emissary that both gain you life on creature ETB. Essence Warden doesn't discriminate and gains you life on opposing creatures entering, whereas Virulent Emissary only cares about your own creatures entering. Since both of these cards are elves, you might as well play some more elves as your rem pieces, you know, the typical suspects. Jadi Offshoot is another 1 mana card that can get you repeatable increments of life, as it has landfall, gain 1 life. There is other really efficient cards like Haywire Might, a 1 mana 1/1 artifact that when it dies, you gain 2 life, and you can sacrifice it for a green to exile target non-creature artifact or non-creature enchantment, a super efficient card in a format like Commander that will also trigger the ability of Lisette. Beledros, we've already talked about. It's a 7 mana 4/4 that just creates a 1/1 black and green pest creature token every single upkeep. Those can of course then trigger your Essence Warden and Virulent Emissary type cards. Aetherflux Reservoir is typically a combo piece, but you could use it in a semi-fair way. Whenever you cast a spell, you gain 1 life for each spell you've cast this turn. Usually you care about this getting to insane values of like 5, 6, 7, 8 life per spell cast, because the payoff is paying 50 life and dealing 50 to target creature or player, so you just kinda storm off. On the topic of Storm, Weather the Storm is a 2 mana instant that says you gain 3 life, Storm, so you get to copy it for each spell that was cast before this card. You could be playing this during another player's turn as a combat trick to surprise them with like 2 or 3 Lisette triggers that put +1/+1 counters on all of your creatures. And then lastly, of course, when you're thinking counters, you're also thinking Proliferate. Carnivorous Canopy is a 3 mana flexible card that destroys an artifact, an enchantment, or a creature with flying, and if that permanent's mana value was 3 or less, you get to Proliferate. One last card that I wanted to mention, because I just see it being an absolute all-star in Cube all the time, and I can't imagine it being much worse in Commander, so I think it's pretty underplayed, is Pest Infestation. For a green and XX, you destroy up to X target artifacts and or enchantments. Then you create twice as many black and green pest creature tokens that, of course, gain you 1 life should they die, thus triggering Lisette, thus giving you a mana sink. Pest Infestation is so good because, yes, it can hit a million artifacts, but even if there's only 1 artifact, you can still pay a bunch of mana to get a lot of pest tokens. The fact that this creates twice as many pest tokens is just absurd. I've teased him, now he's here. Verils the Scar-Striped is one of those commanders where I just built a deck around them before I even got to making this video, because during my research I was so excited. Who's at fault? None other than Reed Duke, who mentioned a mechanic that is printed on this exact card. Verils is a 3-mana 2/2 Troll Warrior, and each creature card in your graveyard has Scavenge. The Scavenge cost is equal to its mana cost. What does Scavenge do? Well, you exile a creature card from your graveyard and pay its mana cost, and then you put a number of +1/+1 counters equal to that card's power on target creature. Scavenge only as a sorcery. Additionally, Verils has Sacrifice another creature, regenerate Verils, which is just chef's kiss on a commander when they can protect themselves. Now, what is the connection to Reed Duke? Well, Wizards put out a promotional video for its Lowen Eclipse release that featured the very famous pro player. In it, they talked about a card called Moonshadow. Moonshadow is a 1-mana 7/7, it has menace, and it enters with 6 -1/-1 counters on it. And whenever 1 or more permanent cards are put into your graveyard from anywhere while this creature has a -1/-1 counter on it, you get to remove a -1/-1 counter from this creature. Now, I do not know why Reed talked about this specific mechanic, because it is so fringe, but cards like Moonshadow, and of course the namesake card Death Shadow, just work so perfectly with Verils that it's almost absurd. Moonshadow in your graveyard is a 1-mana 7/7. The ability is not an effect, right? There's no -1/-1 counters on it in a graveyard. Death Shadow, on the other hand, a 1-mana 13/13 that gets -X/-X, where X is your life total, also a 1-mana 13/13 in your graveyard. A bit different, but for our purposes quite similar, is Phyrexian Dreadnought, a 1-mana 12/12 trample. When it comes into play, you need to sacrifice creatures with total power of 12 or more, or you sacrifice Phyrexian Dreadnought. Now, while this card is pretty difficult to cheat into play if you don't stifle its effect, what we are doing with Verils is different. You mill this card, and then for just a meek 1 mana, you can exile Phyrexian Dreadnought and give 12 +1/+1 counters to any creature on your side of the field. You could be playing this as kind of a stereotypical Voltron deck. Put all your eggs in Verils' basket, because in the end, it can protect itself. But when building the deck around Verils, I found that there is so many good supporting creatures that you don't even need to play this as a one-dimensional Voltron deck. Cards like Kami of Whispered Hopes are incredible. It is a type of creature that adds mana to your mana pool equal to its power. Now there's quite a few of them. I chose Kami of the Whispered Hopes because it also comes with an admittedly small advantage of whenever a +1/+1 counter would be put on a permanent you control. Instead you put 1 more on that permanent. So it's a nice subset. But having a 3-drop that together with Verils and one of those cheap 1-mana extremely high power creatures can suddenly produce 14 mana turn 4 is just absurd. Well, we've talked about these cards before, but they are just, the best cards and payoffs for having large creatures in a deck that cares about self-mill. Altar of Dementia to sacrifice a big thing and mill a lot of cards. Greater Good to sacrifice your largest thing, then draw a million cards and discard your Moonshadows, your Death Shadows, your Phyrexian Dreadnoughts into your graveyard, and then proceed to do absurd things are just gorgeous. And if you're looking for the biggest, the baddest card that could be in your graveyard, no matter the mana cost, well then look no further than the famous Lord of Extinction, a 5-mana star, whose power and toughness are equal to the number of cards in all graveyards, not just your own. What is a bit confusing to newer players is that this effect is continuously checked. So whether it is in your hand, your library, or your graveyard. So when Exile to Scavenge, Lord of Extinction, will always fulfill its role of adding a million counters to your creature. Fati-il-Dal is a 4-mana 3/3 human warrior, and it has only one ability. It taps to either turn target creature's power or toughness to 1 until end of turn. These things were not created equal. Turning a creature's power to 1 is okay as like a combat trick to save yourself some damage or save a creature that is blocking, but giving a creature 1 toughness has just very obvious synergies. We've already talked about -1/-1 counters and the synergies and payoffs we have, and just formally mention cards like Blowfly Infestation, Knights of Souls Betrayal, Necro Skitter are just so good. Massacre Girl and putting -1/-1 counters on things is just a match made in heaven for this commander. I also wanted to mention a few new cards though. Ghastly Demise is a super efficient removal spell in the right deck for just 1 mana and at instant speed. You get to destroy target non-black creature if its toughness is less than or equal to the number of cards in your graveyard. If you're milling yourself a bunch, this card will already be online, but with Fati-il-Dal in play, you'll pretty much always have the ability to destroy something on the field for just 1 mana. Screams from Within goes more into the -1/-1 direction. It's a 3 mana aura that simply gives a creature -1/-1. This would be pretty bad if this was a normal aura because the creature dies, it goes to the graveyard. In this case, whenever enchanted creature is put into a graveyard, you get to return Screams from Within not to your hand, but into play. This means, together with your commander, it just serves as a 1 turn, 1 kill engine. Lastly, I wanted to mention a very funny combo with a card that did get a mention already, but in a very different context. Tree of Perdition, we talked about for it having 13 toughness, which is great, except we can do better in this deck. For 4 mana, again, you get a 0 mana 13 that has Defender and taps to exchange target opponent's life total with this creature's toughness. Now 13 life is not nothing, but 1 life? How about you just target this creature with Fati-il-Dal, give it 1 toughness, and then exchange the toughness and the life total. Vraska the Silencer is one of those commanders where I feel like they play super duper well. I just don't have the best idea to make them interesting to you guys, but maybe you are more creative. It's a 3 mana 3/3. It has Death Touch because it's Vraska. It's a Gorgon Assassin, of course, and whenever a non-token creature an opponent controls dies, you may pay 1 mana. If you do, return that card to the battlefield tapped under your control. It's a treasure artifact with tap, sacrifice this artifact at 1 mana of any color, and it loses all other card types. The reason why this is so difficult to give a good pitch for is because it really depends on your play group or the opponents you're facing that day. Sometimes there's just the juiciest ETBs on the other side and Vraska just goes off so hard, and sometimes you're facing the mono blue player who has nothing but counter spells in their deck. That's me. I'm the blue player. Nonetheless, we can talk about certain things that will always be good inclusions. Cards like Morbid Opportunist, a 3 mana 1/3 that whenever a creature dies you draw a card, but it only triggers once. Or Harvester of Souls, a 6-drop, so much more expensive, but that has the ability whenever another non-token creature dies you draw a card, are of course going to be great in your Vraska deck. You want things to die, so why not benefit of things dying? Since Vraska has Death Touch, you can always fall back to cards like Ram Through, 2 mana instant where target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. Death Touch means just 1 damage is, of course, enough to take down any creature, no matter its toughness. Sheoldred's Edict, for just 2 mana, makes all 3 of your opponents sacrifice a creature, potentially giving you 3 treasures in just 1 turn. And the last card I want to mention is a card that benefits off of your treasures. Revel in Riches is an alternate win con. For 5 mana you get an enchantment. Whenever a creature an opponent controls dies, create a colorless treasure artifact token, and at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control 10 or more treasures, you win the game. What is so nice about this is, yes, it rewards you for the thing you are doing anyways, aka killing opponent's creatures, because you're playing Vraska the Silencer, who wants opposing creatures to die. But then it's also something that can actually end the game, because remember, the creatures that you get as treasures, they can't attack, they're not creatures anymore, they're just treasures. Revel in Riches could solve that problem. Willow Dusk as Sincere already got a mention. As a reminder, she's a 3-mana 3/3 Dryad Druid. For 1 mana and tapping her, choose another target creature, put a number of +1/+1 counters on it, equal to the amount of life you gained this turn, or the amount of life you lost this turn, whichever is greater. Activate only as a sorcery. We have talked about a lot of the pieces that are good here. Loading Zone, Terra Symbiosis both care about large quantities of counters being put on something at the same time. Kami of Whispered Hopes is a card that not only makes it so you put more +1/+1 counters on things, it is also a great beneficiary of said +1/+1 counters because it taps for mana equal to its power. We've also talked about how losing life is a lot easier than gaining life. What are good ways to lose life? Stuff like Necropotence. Yes, it's a game changer, so maybe not for your bracket 3 deck, but for 3 mana you get an enchantment that makes you skip your draw step. Whenever you discard a card, you need to exile that card from your graveyard. But for paying 1 life, you exile the top card of your library face down, and then you put that card into your hand at the beginning of your next end step. This just makes you lose as much life as you want, you get to draw cards for it, and your Willow Dusk gets to tap for a bunch of +1/+1 counters. Hatred is just an obscene card. It's an instant for 5 mana, where you can pay X life to give target creature +X/+0 until end of turn. If you choose to play this sorcery speed during your main phase 1, you can lose, let's say, 20 life, and then tap Willow Dusk to give another 20 +1/+1 counters to target creature you control. A nice way to A, lose life, but then B, also gain life back because, well, we only have 40 life at the start of the game, is Krick, Son of Yawgmoth, a 7 mana card that has 3 Phyrexian black mana in its mana cost, so you can play this turn 4 if you are willing to lose 6 life. What's so nice about this is, for each black mana symbol in a cost, you may instead pay 2 life, making you lose life for Willow Dusk. Also, whenever you cast a black spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Krick, which is, nice upside. But very importantly, this is a creature that has lifelink. The best way to balance out the life loss you need to make Willow Dusk a thing is with a creature that has lifelink, because automatically you will gain back all the life you've lost in a turn if you connect with a creature with lifelink. Winter Cynical Opportunist is the last commander that I'll talk about that cares about card types. For 4 mana, you get a 2/5 Human Warlock, it has Death Touch, and whenever it attacks you mill 3 cards. Once you have Delirium, at the beginning of your end step, you may exile any number of cards from your graveyard with 4 or more card types among them. If you do, put a permanent card from among them onto the battlefield with a finality counter on it. We've jumped through these hoops before. Delirium means Goyfs are a natural inclusion, as they also care about card types in your graveyard. Baba Lysaga is a welcome inclusion, as it also cares about card types and it fuels your graveyard while drawing you cards. We've talked about how artifact creatures are very good, and the same goes for enchantment creatures. But let's dive into a few examples. Since Winter can cheat things into play, I looked at rather expensive enchantment creatures for this commander. Demon of Fate's Design is a 6 mana 6/6 flying trample, and once during each of your turn you may cast an enchantment spell by paying life equal to its mana value rather than paying mana cost. This is of course very nice to reanimate and then immediately get mana cheating out of the thing you just reanimated. It also, for 3 and sacrificing another enchantment, gets +X/+0 until end of turn, where X is the sacrificed enchantment's mana value. Arvinox, the Mind Flail, is a 7 mana 9/9. It is a legendary enchantment creature horror, and it isn't a creature unless you control 3 or more permanents you don't own. How do you get those permanents? Well, at the beginning of your end step, exile the bottom card of each opponent's library face down. For as long as those cards remain exiled, you may look at them, you may cast them, and you may spend mana as though it were mana of any color to cast those spells. So, down the line, you'll get a huge body and a bunch of card advantage. Looking at artifact creatures, the first one I found was Nullstone Gargoyle. Again, we are looking for big, bad stuff to reanimate, so a 9 mana 4/5 with an effect like this is quite welcome. This Gargoyle has flying, and more importantly, whenever the first non-creature spell each turn is played, counter that spell. Winter specifically cares about you putting permanent cards into your graveyard, so you are probably going to play a bunch of creature spells anyways. This effect is super annoying for a lot of people to deal with because somebody will need to bite the bullet and play like 2 removal spells in the same turn, and nobody really wants to do that. On the cheaper end and less of a reanimation target, but even more of a synergy piece, is Hex Parasite, a 1 mana 1/1 insect. For X and a Phyrexian black mana, you get to remove up to X counters from target permanent. For each counter removed this way, Hex Parasite gets +1/+0 until end of turn. Now, viewers that are quite attentive will immediately see the synergy. Winter tries to balance out its very powerful reanimation effect with a finality counter. Remember, should things with a finality counter on them go to the graveyard, instead they are exiled. Hex Parasite, very conveniently, is not only an artifact creature that provides 2 types, should you exile it from your graveyard, but should you have it in play, it can get rid of the finality counter you put on the permanent card you reanimated. In the same vein, our Conduit, while not a creature, is a 2 mana artifact that can tap to remove a counter from a permanent you control, and thus also getting rid of the finality counter. Of course, Glisso Sunslayer can also make an appearance in this category of cards. And we've talked about split cards for their higher mana value, as the 2 mana values of both sides are combined in your graveyard. What is also combined is, well, their types. Cards like Destined to Lead are both an instant and sorcery in your graveyard, and thus provide 2 counts to your Delirium, and of course 2 counts to you exiling a bunch of cards from your graveyard. Our final entry for this Golgari list is an absolute banger. It's Igra, Ita of All, who already got a mention earlier in the video, but its effect is so unique that it would be a shame to not build around it. Igra is a 5 mana elemental cat with a 6/6 stat line. It has ward, like every good commander, but the ward cost is not mana, but instead sacrificing a food. This would be completely broken if not for the other line of text, where other creatures are food artifacts in addition to the other types and have 2 tap, sacrifice as permanent, gain 3 life. Like an actual food token. This means whenever an opponent wants to target Igra, they either need to sacrifice a real food token or one of their creatures. And we do benefit off of this happening, because whenever a food is put into a graveyard from the battlefield, you put 2 +1/+1 counters on Igra, Ita of All. As this cares about food, we've already talked about some incredible synergy pieces here. Gilded Goose is just an all-star whenever it comes to ramping in a food deck. Feasting Troll King is something that can easily come back from your graveyard by sacrificing 3 tokens that are conveniently food in addition to the other types. Night of Sweet's Revenge makes it so all your creatures suddenly tap for green mana. Greta Sweet Tooth, in a similar vein, makes it so you can sacrifice everything and anything on your field with +1/+1 counters on creatures or drawing a card and losing a life. Camellia, who already got a mention in a different section, is even better than previously, as for 3 mana you get a 3/3 Menace, and other scrolls you control have Menace. Yes, that's nice, but whenever you sacrifice 1 or more foods, you create a 1/1 green scroll creature token, which very conveniently, if your commander is in play, is also a food token. Unlike a lot of the other food-centered commanders on this list, Igra, Ita of All opens up some very different possibilities here. One thing that immediately came to mind is, well, if every creature is an artifact, I'm sure there is some degenerate way to combo off. Manifold Key and Voltaic Key both tap for relatively cheap to untap another target artifact. Voltaic Construct is a 4-mana 2/2 who, for just 2 generic mana and not even tapping, can untap target artifact creature. Clock of Omens very famously is a combo piece where you tap 2 artifacts you control to untap an artifact. All of these things can go insanely hard with things that either create mana or create tokens, and I'm sure if you want to go that route, that you will find a lot of ways to go infinite once you have Igra Eater of All and 1 or 2 other pieces on the battlefield. This is not the only route you can go though, because not only are your creatures artifact, but also your opponent's creatures. That means, if you maybe aren't playing that many creatures, Emi Statue is probably an auto-include. For 3 mana, you get an artifact from Kamigawa that reads, players can't untap more than 1 artifact during their untap steps. Now, not only are most players playing artifact as ramp spells, but they're also playing creatures. And suddenly, you're making them choose. Do I want to untap 1 creature or 1 ramp artifact? Null Rod hates on activated abilities of artifacts as players simply cannot activate activated abilities of artifacts. And a very good card in general is Manglehorn, a 3-mana 2/2 that when it enters destroys target artifact, which is already great, weird and flexible format like Commander, but it also makes artifacts your opponent's control enter the battlefield tapped, thus making all of their creatures enter tapped. One card that did not get a mention yet, but similarly to Camellia is kind of perfect for an Ygritte deck, is Experimental Confectioner, a 3-mana 2/3. When it enters, you create a food token, and when you sacrifice a food, you create a 1/1 black-red creature token with this creature can't block. Let's say you have Camellia and Experimental Confectioner out, and both of those creatures saying whenever you sacrifice a food, create a creature. That is, of course, a food also. And you pair it with a card like Savvy Hunter, who sacrifices 2 foods to draw a card. Suddenly you go infinite and draw your entire deck. And the last card we're gonna talk about in this video is Viridian Revel. 3-mana enchantment. Whenever an artifact is put into an opponent's graveyard from the battlefield, you draw a card. I think this should be an auto-include in every Igra deck. Most of the time you're gonna play a bunch of artifact removal because green has a lot of very efficient artifact removal, and having Viridian Revel in play whilst you're removing your opponent's creatures who are very conveniently artifacts, you will be drawing a bunch of cards, and this will be probably one of the best cards in your deck. I hope you enjoyed this comeback as much as I did. As a reminder, I did stream the research process for this video on my YouTube channel, and I got some great suggestions that really enhanced this experience. So if you want to check out the commanders together with me and give some suggestion and leave your mark on this video, if you will, make sure to check. I mostly stream on Mondays and Tuesdays. So maybe see you on Monday, maybe see you in the next video. But anyways, always remember, be kind to yourself and others. Goodbye.